Hello, welcome to another episode of Design Disruption. I am Sam Lubell, and this is my co-host Pratima Manohar, and we are thrilled to be welcoming another guest who is a specialist in disruption. As you know, design disruption is taking the disruption, incredible amount of transformation that COVID has instigated, and we're using that as a jumping off point. And we're looking at disruption throughout the design world, not just from COVID, but from global warming and from changes in population and from everything else that's shifting design radically in the coming years. And we are welcoming Jonathan Ward, who's a design partner at NBBJ, definitely a specialist in disruption. And what we are talking about disrupting in this episode is the entire city. And Jonathan is leading the design of a future city in China called the TenCent Net City. And so he's going to tell us a little bit about that, and we'll use that as a jumping off point to talk about disrupting cities in general. So Jonathan, welcome. We really appreciate you being here.
Thanks, Sam. It's great to be here. Really looking forward to digging into the conversation. You know, what better thing to talk about than the city, which certainly could use some disrupting these days.
Yes. So we hope you're well. I hope you've been surviving the pandemic.
Oh yeah. You know, just sitting here in my bedroom for 12 months now. It's been great.
All right. Well, I hope you got out a couple times, but that's good.
Oh yeah.
Jonathan, welcome to the Design Disruption. You know, in this series, we've been profiling ideas of how to build back better. And one of the key trends that we have to focus on is urbanization. Really kind of break or make the future of our society from a sustainability perspective, from the perspective of inclusion and equity. So we're so thrilled today to be chatting with you about future cities. And I know you have some introductory thought on the same. So I'm actually going to quickly dig up your slides so you can share your kind of blueprint for what we should be thinking about when we build future cities. So I have just pulled up your slides, Jonathan, and after your initial remarks, I'm really excited to have this important conversation.
Great. You can see the full screen now?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, great. Okay. So thanks everybody for having me on. You know, this is, you know, a great opportunity to talk about where the city could maybe going in the future, what we're learning about, you know, today, what we're learning from the pandemic. But, you know, a lot of these changes, as Sam, you noted, were underway moving forward. And we've been, you know, testing them and developing them on this project in particular, TenCent Net City, which is located in Shenzhen, China. And TenCent is, you know, one of the world's largest internet-based companies, and we've been working with them for quite a while. I just want to preface that because we designed their headquarters. I guess we started designing it about 10 years ago. It was built maybe 5 years ago. And that was also about disrupting the high-rise building and how you can actually get people to interact more in this very difficult format, which is, you know, in a way anti-connective. So we started thinking about that as and then how do you apply that to the city? And we started thinking about the city as more of a distributed network rather than a sort of typical sort of linear network. That was a starting point. And here you can see the view of the city as it sits on Dashanwan Bay, which is on the far west side of the city as it kind of reaches out to the larger ocean. So a pretty amazing site, but it's part of a larger master plan development around the entire bay that this piece is then plugging into. And you know, this idea of this distributed network was really the starting point where, you know, when we look at the internet, we look at how social applications work. We look how nature works as an ecosystem, and we thought that was a bit, you know, more interesting place to start than the typical machine-driven linear network. So that was the underlying fabric that we created to really wire more, better, and more effective connections across the city. And you can see here, you have this typical grid of the city on the left. You know, in the grid, you know, I guess you could trace it back to the Romans being very efficient with their military operations, but also, the grid facilitates the car. It facilitates the machine, not necessarily the person. And we said, okay, well, what happens if we want to facilitate the sort of human brain and the human movement and interaction with people, which of course is difficult to do right now, but it will be, coming back. And let's de-emphasize the car. And then so we took that grid and we started bending it and creating these hotspots at those bend points. And then we also started interacting with the shoreline, thinking about, sea water rise, thinking about climate change, and that whole edge became much more of a performative shoreline. And finally, that all blends together in this network city. And we have some sort of key principles that we then wove into the overall city, this idea of internetworked, integrated, humanistic, and organic ecosystems. And those became, guidelines for what do we put, how do we organize the framework, the overall framework. And when we think about internetwork, that's going back to this distributed, decentralized network. The typical city, as we see it, is the centralized network on top. So we want diverse connections. So promote more community spirit, from our viewpoint, and more innovation. And if you do a map of cities that, a lot of traditional cities do work on this decentralized network process. But a lot of the new ones don't, and you can sort of feel the difference between the two of them. Nonlinear, sort of this idea of nonlinear systems. The human brain is always craving what's around the corner, not what's 10 miles down the straight road. And I think that also then sort of creates a sense of discovery, curiosity, and of sort of smaller scale within a bigger scale of experiences. And also overlaying this whole IoT network on top of this is a big part of what we've been integrating into the city, whether it's movement systems, whether it's controls of overall systems, whether it's individual or organizational controls. That becomes a big part of it, also driving down the energy consumption. And we think about it as integrated. So, de-siloing the city is really important. So this is where it becomes really challenging in general. The more we can de-silo the city, the more we can integrate nature, the more we can integrate different uses, the more we can also create more equity in the city. And that's something that we're really keen on. So it's probably the hardest thing to do in any of these sort of, these efforts we've been undergoing in designing the city. Because there's a mindset, so there's the car as machine driving the city, and there's this mindset of easy silos in the city. And then thinking about land use, can land use strategies be vertical? Can you run those in sort of a vertical strategy as you think about the city that can allow you to densify and then reduce the consumption of green space around the city? And then think of the city as a park is another way we've started thinking about it. And then, so this humanistic, I've talked about car-free, thinking about culture, in this case, engaging Shenzhen city culture with TenCent culture in a way to create a unique experience. And then the whole, again, the smart city IoT overlay on top of that. And then thinking about finally this organic ecosystem. And this image on the right is interesting. This is the shoreline, typical tree, the mango tree as a typical shoreline of Shenzhen, this whole region, where the change of tides, protecting the waterfront. That was just sort of something that just happened through the way the ecosystem developed. So we try to learn from this, implement it, quite literally, but also implement it conceptually in the way that we started thinking about the city as an ecosystem, and that sort of waterfront as driver of knowledge. We sort of use that knowledge to think about building the city. So that gives you a quick overview. There's not a lot of detail there. We wanted to get some of the thoughts about how we started developing this new city thinking. With that, I think I'll stop sharing.
Thank you. That's a wonderful overview. Pratima, I think you're on mute.
Thank you, Jonathan. I just wanted to highlight for our audience, and we have people joining us from everywhere. Sonny says he's from China and he's super interested in this project. And I just want to highlight that the size of city is almost equal to the size of Midtown Manhattan. So it's a large, urban kind of hub. Before we kind of dive into this project itself, I wanted to, kind of deep dive into this whole agenda of cities in general. I want to point out how this is probably the biggest challenge that we're facing at this point in time, right? How do we urbanize? How do we urbanize well? And I loved one of the principles that was mentioned about TenCent City, where you focused on how to make people at the heart of the city development and not just the motor car. So tell us a little bit about this vision and tie this to the bigger agenda of urbanization. How, outline, the challenges that we face as we build these cities of the future, and highlight what solutions will be useful as we think about future cities. Jonathan.
It's fun and easy to say carless city. It's a big challenge, of course, because everybody relies on the car in our cities, and our cities have been since before World War II have been largely built around the efficiency of the car. So that's something that's a big challenge. At the same time, as we know through looking at city planning over the years, that's been a big challenge in terms of humanizing the city, because you're letting the machine drive sense of distance, sense of connectivity, sense of scale, and that has been a real problem. So, but the solution is probably not a wholesale. Hey, we're gonna get rid of cars. Obviously, we know that's not realistic at the moment, but we know there's some things we can do to, in a way, make it a little bit more difficult for the car in the city, which slows it down. Which de-emphasizes it. You don't necessarily want to hide it in all cases. Sometimes you may want to, but we've looked at it in terms of different scales of effort. One scale is like, hey, let's look at the way we shape our blocks, and that's getting back to our bending and folding that network. And by shaping the blocks in a certain way, we work with Bureau Happold on the transit planning on this, is by just adjusting the angles of turns, the way the streets are neck down or threaded, it slows everything down and it makes it a little bit more difficult for them to move around. And that's a good thing, actually, because suddenly you're starting to de-emphasize while still letting it function, but you're de-emphasizing it. You're emphasizing the pace of human scale movement. And you're seeing some of this, in Toronto and even New York City. There's some interesting studies happening on the same front. And the other side of the coin is, to then on the actual planning of the infrastructure beyond the shape of the roads and the angles and those sorts of things. As we connect across this entire city element, using, obviously people movement systems, but also we started looking at introducing other alternative ways of moving people around, whether it's sort of autonomous people movers and things like that. That's something that we think could also supplant the reliance on the car once you're at the overall district.
Right. I think it's even just your question. It's like, in order to do that, you're questioning sort of the basis of what cities have been built on for the last, almost a century. But that kind of disruption, that's fascinating to me, and it's something I don't think people realize how widely it's being done. People are building new cities, so they're having to rethink, okay, what does the city mean? What is working? What is not? And I think for me, it's like I want to take a step back and even talk about the model itself, because it's not the way a traditional city developed. What you're doing, you're working with the tech company TenCent, one of the major tech companies in China, and you're working with this, the city of Shenzhen. You're working with the communist government. You're working with the kind of a huge amount of people, but you're rethinking the whole model of a city. And I'm curious about that, how you kind of take a step back and say, everything's different. The model of how we're going to build it, about how we're going to organize it, who's in charge, how we're going to think about it. So maybe just give us a little bit of background on that.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good question, because it's interesting that the development design of cities over the past generation or two has been, again, as I mentioned earlier, largely reliant on the car-based strategies. And I think what's interesting when you integrate someone like TenCent, who's thinking about how to connect people, that's their business really. Their WeChat app is probably the largest connective social app in the world. So they're interested in connecting people. So when you integrate that thinking into an urban design problem, and then together with the city like Shenzhen, which is really pushing at the cutting edge of where cities could go, something different can happen. And it's perhaps more difficult if it's just the city authorities you're working with, depending on their position, because there's so many layers you have to go through. But I think if you have that partnership, there's something really intriguing about the partnership of technology, social connectivity, building the roots of a strong city, and that I think is an interesting model. You're seeing that happen in some other places around the world right now. The challenge then is also making sure that it's connected to the overall fabric of the city. It's not its own thing, and that's what we've also been working with the city on.
Right. So how do you connect it to the rest of the city? It's not its own like autonomous little island.
Yeah. So there's in this case, we've been working with the city very closely to integrate 2 new subway metro lines, and so those are all coming around this entire bay, linking the bay, and also making sure that the connection points are at key aspect, those hotspot nodes I talked about earlier, to activate this part of the city and have rapid connection back into the rest of the city. And then obviously we have to still deal with getting the car here. That's still the reality. And then there's a higher speed train connection as well. So those linkages, the car, the train, the subway, making sure that those all function, and then looking at other water connections, around the bay, something's being developed as well.
One of the missions of the TenCent city is to not just put people's needs on top, but also the environmental needs. Yeah. Could you describe to us, how different a place that puts environment and people's needs on top, what does that city look like and feel like? How different is it from the cities that we all live in at the moment?
Yeah.
What our experience going to be like if we lived in this future city?
Yeah, maybe I could share one quick slide just for fun.
Sure.
This is a bit of an extreme situation here, but so my view is sort of this situation where the future of the city really is much more fused with nature, and and that's this is just again a sketch thought that I did, but the idea that currently there you sprinkle some trees around, maybe you have a park here or there, and that's kind of it. But our thought is, well, number one, we want to have this sort of relationship with the waterfront here at this particular design, which is why I talked about this performative edge. But in the future, even going further than that, there's no reason why, in some ways, the nature could be in, whatever the proportion, 50-50 balance with the human-made object in space. All of the vertical surfaces, the horizontal surfaces are opportunities for green space. And that only, benefits our overall planetary carbon situation. That benefits people. We've done a lot of work with a neuroscientist in our organization, thinking about nature and sort of brain cognitive, activity and behavior. And simply being around nature is only going to enhance everybody's well-being and performance. And so that's another aspect of it. And then there's the heat reduction aspect of it, particularly a city like Shenzhen, where you want to mitigate the heat situation with the sun and everything. So there's a whole host of reasons why you do that. But I think a much more aggressive 50-50 or more proportion of nature and city is something that I see as a future aspect.
Right. And I guess that kind of organic integration to me is really interesting. And I think another level of that kind of integration is the tech. It's something that we're just getting our bearings on. How do you incorporate tech really effectively and organically into the city? And it seems like it's integrated everywhere here. And it's also inspired by tech, just like, our dominant technologies drive our cities in a lot of ways, like the car did. And now it seems like the digital technology is doing now. So I'm curious if you could give us a little bit more detail about how technology will be embedded into every aspect of life, and then what are the obviously there's pros and cons to that, but you're looking at the pros. So maybe you can talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, there's definitely pros and cons on that whole front. We spent a lot of time, basically, I wouldn't, at the master planning level, enabling a framework for the technology overlay, because technology is of course going to change in 5 years or 3 years or 6 years. So we didn't make that like that. Hey, it's all about, it's got to be this technology now. It's this current version of IoT stuff, it's smart city, all that stuff. That was not the main driver. The main driver was, finding a way for the framework and the armature of the city to enable more community, more connectivity, and more of basically a healthy way of being in the city. Overlaying on top of that, enabling the framework for an agile institution of different technologies over time, and being able to control things in terms of the energy consumption, the daylight, the movement systems, all those sorts of things can be controlled much more efficiently with that IoT technology.
Right, and I guess somebody already in the audience asked about the idea of using data to kind of measure what's successful and what's not, so you can sort of keep changing as it goes, which is fascinating to me.
And that I would say that's the next level of development of the master plan. So we've developed the framework, and then obviously everybody's very keen on the data front, because the data will tell you a lot. Say, hey, this is working, this is not working, can we modify this? So that's definitely coming in the next round of development. Right,
and sorry, one more follow-up to that, because you work and live in a city that's been disrupted in many ways by technology companies, Seattle, notably Amazon, and worked for them quite a bit. And other cities like San Francisco have been disrupted, not always in good ways, by tech companies. So you have a tech company here, TenCent, that's trying to do something from scratch. So what are they sort of learning to maybe make things a little less disruptive to housing, to the market, to sort of the city itself?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure I have all the detailed answers to that one, Sam. I think they've been doing a lot of work to ensure that at least this piece of this overall Dashan Bay development has enough of the mixture of residential, commercial, and amenities and retail and civic elements. Right. So I think their main goal is to make sure that the balance is right, and then that balance is then reflective across the entire bay, so that this node in Shenzhen, which is very important for their sort of future vision of the city, has that right sort of balance, so that people can actually afford to live there. They can afford to walk to work and not have to live 5,000 miles away and take a bus every day. So I think that's been on the agenda in terms of how this piece of the development and the overall bay has been developed.
So this kind of can become a blueprint for other development in the area.
I think it could be, yeah.
Right.
Jonathan, I want to talk to you a little bit about one of the big kind of crises future cities will have to handle, which is climate change. Mm-hmm. We are going to see, extreme kind of weather events. We're already seeing flooding in a lot of, tropical cities, coastal cities. I think this year has been, we've seen a lot of news about how climate is changing, and our cities, the current cities are not yet equipped to deal with that. So in the TenCent city, how seriously have you kind of considered the climate risks, and are there adaptation tools or designs that have been integrated to deal with this big kind of climate emergency that we're all facing?
So yeah, a couple points on that. That's definitely central to the bigger challenge that's in front of us. So we started, when there's 2 or 3 or 4, whatever, but I'll talk about 2 key aspects. One is we started, as I noted in my earlier slides, is that we started thinking about, what are the big impacts here? There's there's a big impact on the resiliency and seawater rise. So we sort of thought about that one. There's a big impact on rainwater, collecting rainwater and dealing with its runoff, because they have torrential monsoons during that season here. And so dealing with rainwater is the second one, in a way that's intelligent and sustainable. And then the third one is energy consumption. And I'm just highlighting those 3. But so on the resiliency, in learning from our good friend the mangrove tree, that system is a very intelligent way of dealing with change of tides, change of flooding, change of seasons. And we really thought about the whole edge of the site as sort of this, constructed mangrove sponge in a way. And that starts to help mitigate those changes over time. And so that was number one, because it was such a, in your face issue that we have to deal with on this site. And as you know, on coastal cities around the world. The second one is thinking about the water. So, which is interesting that Shenzhen has adopted this sponge city protocol for their developments, and that's sort of again trying to drive intelligence into all the developments of the city, where dealing rather than laying down sheets of asphalt and concrete and a couple of those trees, and wondering where the water is going to go when it comes down in those seasonal rains, and so developing catchment systems, developing ways to slow it down on each one of the sites, developing ways to store it and use it again as well. So those systems become integral to the overall development. And finally, on the energy side, there's energy generation. There's also energy sort of reducing energy utilization and heat gain. And I'd say that's part of the next round of development in more detail, which is just starting, where we're looking at actual architecture and buildings and how that infrastructure can deal with, in a passive way and an active way, with energy consumption. And that's also building on some of the work we did at their headquarters building, as I noted earlier, which has a pretty aggressive passive self-shading system on the facade. So we're looking to take that technology to the next level.
Amazing. I love the concept that China is really embracing of sponge cities, just having these natural barriers that absorb water rather than putting up walls, and they can often become parks and public spaces. And we talked a little bit about that in our last episode, that concept. And I think it's sort of taking another step back into the way cities are evolving. I want to ask you more about that. You're talking about the buildings and the design. I do want to ask you about that in a second, but I was going to share a couple of other examples just to put this in context for our viewers, because this is not something that's totally new.
Right.
We've been building future cities literally for millennia, and it really this whole trend really started to take off last century, when we had the technology to do cities quickly, because of the building technologies. So let me see if I can share my screen. Can you guys see that?
Yeah, we see it.
Okay, great. So first, I'm going to give you a few examples. Give our audience, our audience a few examples of sort of cities rising from scratch. and we'll start with the mid-century, mid 20th century. This and Pratima, you'll know this well as well. This is Srinagar, the capital of Punjab, and famously laid out by Le Corbusier. There's the assembly on the right there, and there's sort of the plan on the left, sort of the modernist, very rigorous, structured, modernist way of living, based on modernist planning and architectural principles, but also very well incorporated into the landscape, which is something I think modernism doesn't always get credit for. And then also in India, this is one I love, which is Auroville in Pondicherry, and just an incredible. On the right, that's the vision, and on the left, that's actually reality, and based on much more kind of utopian, even spiritual kind of designs, and very much like a utopian sort of community. So a different, but kind of incredible new city that was planned in India. Then you have Brasilia, Niemeyer's grand modernist, more sculptural new city in Brazil. And again, you have these, very massive modernist kind of designs that overlaid onto and kind of starting from scratch onto an existing city, not necessarily taking in the existing city though, sort of one of the faults, and very much car-based, all of these. And that kind of spread out all over the world. You had in France what were called the Ville Nouvelle, new cities all around. This is all outside of Paris, but they're all around the country, starting from scratch, based again on modernist principles. In England, you had a new town movement. In the US, you had new towns, new cities. This is Reston, Virginia, sort of brutalist, based on very pedestrian and kind of smaller scale, even if it's in a brutalist kind of style. I've been there. It's actually, parts of it are quite lovely, and there's narrow paths that take you from one village to the next. So it's got this sort of giant scale mixed and sort of brutal scale mixed with kind of the nature and the human scale. It's an interesting combination. And then you have the factory model city, which is Levittown. The first one of those is in New York, but they went everywhere, and it's literally the factory model coming to build houses. And then you have more recent cities from scratch, starting sort of at the end of the last century. This is sort of the grand pompous city from scratch in Kazakhstan, Astana, basically just a monument to the power of the leadership in some ways. And then you have one of the first eco-cities completed. I've actually been here, Masdar, designed by Foster, and one of kind of an incredible effort to do an eco-city in the middle of the desert. But they've done an interesting job, and it's actually quite livable and better than I expected as a place to be, and it's expanding. And there are a lot of interesting technologies and designs there. Then in Korea, we talk about digital cities. Songdo is one of the first cities based really on digital technology. Some of it, which is already getting a little out of date, actually, but that's another story. But also based on kind of more natural urban planning. On the top, you see sort of their quote unquote Central Park, based on New York Central Park. And then you also have kind of iconic architecture and bridges. So it's this mix of digital and sort of iconic architecture, and very much about new technology. Also in China, the Chengdu is doing its future city. Also has its Central Park there. Pedestrian scale is becoming part of it. Eco is becoming a huge part. Otherwise, China's realizing it will not survive if it doesn't do that, as you know. I noticed this on the left. They have a central pavilion, which had a striking resemblance to the vessel here in New York.
It's really similar.
I couldn't help but notice that. And then you talk about walkability. Ironically, Toyota is doing a city based largely away from the car. They're really embracing mobility in these pods and walkability and pedestrian scale. So I thought that was interesting. And these are just everywhere. You have cities on the coast, like Ream City in Cambodia. A lot of them built on landfill. Building entirely new coastal cities. You talked about greenery, and you talked about sort of the incorporating nature. This is Forest City in Malaysia is really doing that, trying to do that. All the buildings, all the landscapes, really taking advantage of that sort of lush landscape. And then Port City in Colombo all on landfill, which is a tradition that dates back, to the 19th century in our country, and 20th century, like Back Bay and large parts of New York are all built on landfill. And so those are happening. And then there are the new cities that are not from scratch, but they sort of are. And that includes Hudson Yards in New York, I think is basically, it's a whole new city in New York. Kind of came up very quickly, built on top of old rail yards. And then Dubai, in a lot of ways, based on the global capital and the wealth of oil, became its own city very almost overnight in some respects. I mean, Dubai was a thriving city and a port way back when, even before oil was discovered in the UAE. But once oil was discovered and the wealth really ramped up, things changed quickly, very, very quickly. So yeah, those are just some examples. Obviously, we could go on forever because there's a lot of new cities. I don't think people realize the scale of that. So going back to your plans, Jonathan, I think in that grand tradition, obviously you're learning lessons, you're making your own kind of ideals, and then you're trying to make it into something real. And that's, to me, is like, how do you design a city from scratch? I just want to give people maybe a little bit more insight into what is the architecture going to look like? What are these streets going to look like? So maybe you can take people a little bit more on that sort of, what is the process of laying this city out as you're going through this?
Yeah. So the process that so far, just in the middle of it, the process was to basically create a refined framework, which is the master plan first. So that was a year plus effort to go through and define the roadway systems, the infrastructure, both from transit to automobile to systems, all the systems overlays, the key sort of programmatic sort of finalization of the plan, the experiential aspects, the scale issues, and all those sort of landscape performative strategies. So we develop all that, and then now we're at the point where we're developing architecture, and so bringing in also other architects into the conversation at the moment. So it becomes also more of a varied, diverse city is something that's really key to TenCent and from our view as well. And so that's the process now. And in that part of the process, thinking about more sort of clearly, okay, well, now we have a framework, we have a strategy, we have a vision for what kind of city it is. And then now it's, what should the architecture be? And that's also being seen through the lens of, again, like you said earlier, through the lens of the city, through the lens of TenCent, through our lens of what we think this all may want to be in the future. And we're just kind of, I'd say, in the early days of that process, and that gets into all those issues of scale, issues of experience, issues of passive shading, and all the energy systems and all of those sorts of things. And even to the issue of what are we making it out of? What's the embodied carbon? What starting to get into that thought process as well.
Right, and there's also the challenge of making this. I mean, you're not a local firm. You're not from China. So how are you going to make this feel like something that grows out of Shenzhen and grows out of China and feels to some extent authentic that way?
And that's an interesting challenge in working in Shenzhen. We've been working there for a long time and thinking about because it's such an interesting city that the making sure that it has some resonance with larger culture in China and larger geographical place, but also thinking about Shenzhen as this amazing new city. It's the melting pot of China, really. And I think that's also an interesting sort of thread to weave in. That's, we've done quite a few projects there over the past decade where there's an interest in weaving those two thoughts together. Thought about, the sort of cultural connections, new city vision, but also, how do we innovate on what we're thinking, whether it's the single building innovation of the high rise or the city or the district, and as a city of innovation, as a city of, so again, where, it was a fishing village in 1982.
Yeah, yeah.
It's such an amazing
The
place.
Dubai of China in a way, yeah.
Yeah, that's right.
Jonathan, I want to talk to you about the fact that cities are, in a way, physical manifestation of economic development, right? Cities grow based on their ability to provide economic opportunity and decline if opportunity vanishes. So when we build a city from scratch, how do you address that issue? Because historically, a lot of urban development has happened organically. So one of the big risks with building new cities is that they could turn out to be ghost cities, like neighborhoods and cities that China has built. How are you addressing that issue of creating economic drivers to ensure that this is a place that thrives?
Yeah. Well, yeah, as a starting point, again, maybe that's again the advantage of an organization like TenCent being involved, is it won't start out as a ghost city. And a lot of those are speculative, let's make money quick sort of approaches, but which don't always pan out. So that's, I think, the first thing just to underline. But I think the other thing to note is that is the framework and is the architecture flexible enough to adapt to the future? That's one question. Is the urban experience and the urban framework hospitable? I use that term because I think about my own experiences growing up. And my father was a urban designer, urban planner. Yeah, and he was in St. Louis, Missouri, where they did a pretty good job of destroying the city post-war. You didn't even need a war, and they did a job of destroying it by building things that were completely mismatched with human experience, completely mismatched scale with a sense of social connectivity, sense of again silo breaking and equity. And Pruitt-Igoe is just the sort of the cherry on top of that whole process. But they did a number on that city, and he spent his whole career trying to reverse engineer the problems that were made. And I think what I took away from that experience is in a lot of those examples you showed, Sam, there's a scale problem.
Right.
I think we were all sort of enamored with the machine, with the bravado of post-war whatever was in everybody's mind, and the scale was just completely out of whack. So I think, and what I'm getting at here, so my long-winded rambling answer is that if we can get the scale right, if we the framework that's adaptable and agile enough to deal with so the buildings could be anything in the future, and then we get the right sort of investment up front that is going to supercharge it in a way and not allow it to just be a scaleless ghost city. That was a good example you showed a few minutes ago.
Yeah, I don't know if you're looking at it now. Pratima, can you pull that up? I can't tell if it's showing. Yeah, and a couple of these are from Ordos, which was supposed to be a great new city in Inner Mongolia, and didn't really, or hasn't really happened. Certainly not the human scale that you guys are talking about.
No, to me that image on the left is it's fascinating because that could be one of those modernist cities. That could be it's car driven. The scale is about the car. The scale is not about people. The scale is about economic gain in some ways. And it's unfortunate that those sort of models are still being replicated.
Yeah, and it's interesting that those ghost cities. I've read a little bit about them. Sometimes they stay that way and nobody comes, and sometimes it just takes a long time. It's like it'll be a ghost city and then it won't. People will come.
That's true.
And it's hard to predict, but it's pretty stark when it's empty like that and it's that buildup. And I think you guys obviously are doing everything you can to not. It doesn't look like you're going to have a ghost city on your hands.
Try not to, yeah.
So, do you want to move on to? Should we move on to the quickfire segment?
Yeah, sure.
Great. So the next segment that we like to do is called quickfire. Jonathan, we'll get to know you a little bit better and a little bit differently with some short questions, and also a section where we may or may not, where we'll both try to sketch, which I'm, as Pratima knows, I'm really bad at. So, but it's fun. So Pratima, why don't you ask a couple of quick fire?
Yeah, and this is just a fun kind of segment where we want to get to know you a little bit better, Jonathan. So please indulge us. So my first question to you is, electric car or a metro?
I'm sorry, you cut out at the first part there. The first choice.
I think she said, do you prefer the idea of the electric car or the metro?
Oh, and ultimately, I think the metro is the way to go.
I think Jonathan's video has frozen.
Oh, I think it froze on your side, but I still have him, so it's okay.
You still have him? Okay, great.
Yeah. The tech city of the future hasn't figured out we haven't figured out how to do this yet. That's okay.
Okay.
So, Jonathan, you mentioned you live in Seattle.
Portland.
Oh, excuse me. Now you're in Portland. That's right.
Portland, LA. So I go back and forth between.
Right. No, I saw you in Seattle, but you're in Portland. Yeah. So, what is your favorite part of the city? What is the place that you really love?
I think that, again, we're new to this city. And I think that my favorite part is the fact that you can walk from a neighborhood center to a forest, and it's all within, a short walking distance. And I think that scale is amazing. And that's something to think about as we think about future cities.
Yeah, you got your forest city, sort of happening already.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And it's hard to do when you get into Portland's a manageable scale. When you get into a larger scale, that becomes a lot harder.
It's much more difficult. Yeah.
Jonathan, which is the most creative part of your day?
The creative part of my day is usually, when I have a moment to sit and sketch and draw and think about what we're up to in our projects and in our world.
So this one is, it's a tougher question, but some people talk about new cities and they say how it can't be sustainable, because how can you build a new city from scratch and have that be sustainable versus, retrofitting existing cities? So what is your argument?
Well, I think it's both and, right? So the retrofitting of our cities is crucial to where we're going, where we need to go. But at the same time, given, like you mentioned earlier, economic demands, growth demands, the retrofitting can only go so far. And I so think if you can build a new city that uses resources more wisely, is built in a way that can last, hundreds of years, somewhere where people want to be in a great experience, I think those things, can outweigh the other costs. Now, I think the other thing you could also think about is weaving a new city into an old city. So sort of a hybrid, where if you can, massively densify one of these cities, which is, misproportioned, I think then you can renew and renovate infrastructure, but also integrate more density to, again, limit the boundaries of the city, which is, I think, another strong strategy here in Portland.
And I hope we can weave some of the better ideas of these new cities into our cities in our country.
I hope so. That's definitely would be a good goal.
Great. Thank you, Jonathan, for that. And maybe now we can get our sketch pads out. And I'm going to ask both of you to draw the skyline of a future city, and we can discuss it. And in the meantime, I want to say hello to the amazing audience that joins us from all over the world. Thank you. And if you have any questions for Jonathan, please feel free to ask them in the comment box below. We have people joining us from around the world, even today. We have someone from China, Mexico City, and we have a few comments as well, which let me try to read out a few. Tiago Lopez says, I work in the traditional automotive space, but the dream dream about new mobility solutions. and he's asking us about ideas for integrating prosumer type of projects, grow sell vegetables in the community type of thing. That's a great question, Tiago, and I'm going to try to get Jonathan to respond to it in a minute. Peter is joining us from Seattle, and he has a question about does city planning and replanning react to the wealth normal distribution curve or nudge society towards a different wealth normal distribution curve? Wow, that's a very technical question, and we'll see if Jonathan can comment on that as well. So let us know if you have any comments or questions for our guests today. And also, we'd love to hear about your thoughts on what principles the cities of future should embrace. If you have any thoughts on that, please share it in the comment box below as well. And you can use the hashtag design disruption so we can find it a little bit later. And tell us where all of you are joining us from so we can track you and figure out what context you're talking to us about. Sam,
Okay.
looks like your sketch is ready, huh?
I think so. Yeah, I'll go first so I make Jonathan look better.
Sure, go ahead.
So here's my skyline.
Okay, let me make that
All right.
first.
There you go. So it's not as tall as our skylines now. It's a mix of scales.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I think it's really driven by the design is driven by nature and by sustainability. Those are trees and windmills and solar panels, and then water's running through it. And again, you have the scale shifts, so it feels a little bit more like a regular village neighborhood kind of condition. And there's nature everywhere. I think that's something that we really messed up on the first time around with cities. So there you go. That's my.
Thank you, Sam. That was nice. Jonathan?
Sure. So mine. Oopsie, over here.
Yeah, that's better.
So I was
Park
thinking about
clouds.
park clouds. If you can, as we densify to, sort of control our use of our resources around our cities, we can snip out pieces of the nature and put them at different levels of the city. We can have parks that are floating up as if on top of a hilltop, parks that are at the ground plane, inserted experiences, water that flows through, and then sort of a dynamic scale of people walking up and down and through the city.
I love it. Beautiful. Jonathan,
I love it too.
collecting these, so please, if you don't mind scanning that and sending to us, we're still collecting these.
Sure thing.
And that's beautiful.
Yeah, that's a city we'd like to live in with lots of access to nature. Thank you, Jonathan. That was great.
Pleasure.
Can we take a couple of questions at this point in time? I thought this was an interesting question. Does city planning or replanning redistribute wealth curves? It's a bit, looks like Peter is an economist because it's a bit technical. I'm assuming what he means is, does it move the city to becoming more equitable? Is that how you'd read this question?
So that's how I read the question. Yeah, I think that's. I mean, again, if you do it right, yeah, it should move in that direction. I think it's. I mean, it's interesting to see. Cities are definitely wrestling with this right now. I mean, again, Portland's a great example of a city that's wrestling with it. It's a smaller scale, so it's maybe easier to try to get to it. And there's so many equity issues in all of our cities. But I think that the way that you can, allow people to move around. So I think the big turning point in cities like Portland or other cities is the integration of transit. So it's easy to get people from A to B. As long as you make that difficult, it's never going to be equitable. It's going to be, fortress silos. And I think LA is a good example of fortress silos that are just really disconnected sort of fiefdoms throughout the city. Now, when they finally got the metro groups of all the different regions together, I think that'll change things, and it's starting to change things in LA. And it's obviously a much bigger scale, but that's step number one. And without that, you're always going to have that imbalance.
Right. And here's another. Oh, go ahead, Pratima.
Okay, I have a question. I think there are two related questions from Tiago, who's talking about new types of mobility solutions and ideas for integrating prosumer type of projects. And he is also asking us, he's kind of stating that traditional automotive companies are fighting back and they have plans to integrate cars in the living rooms. So how any ideas on how to kind of tackle this?
I guess that's like the mobile living room with the automated car. I don't.
Maybe I'm not sure how to beat it out of the living room, but I think that the car is a challenge. I think it's one of our biggest challenges. Obviously, from a climate change point of view, from an equity point of view, and if there's one thing, and I don't have the solution here for that problem right now, other than what we're starting to do in our city designs, but I think if there can be a realignment of how we move people around, in a way that's a little bit more equitable, that's really the only way to get to the bottom of a lot of these problems. I don't think I can answer the living room issue, but the more that the automotive business is pushing their business to other realms to make sure they sell more cars, we're always going to be in the same cycle of challenges.
Right. And one more question that, especially the second part, we talked about collaborating, because I think that's when you're doing a project this large, it's going to take a lot of collaboration. I mean, what has that been like? Have you been collaborating with some Chinese firms, and what is sort of the give and take that you've had there so far?
Oh yeah, and again, for a long time, we've been working with Chinese design firms, and from our viewpoint, it's crucial whether we're working in another city in the U.S. or whether we're working in another country to collaborate with someone who really knows that place. And we see that as nothing but a positive. And like, if I think one of the best examples was the TenCent headquarters, where we collaborated with TJA, which is one of the big institutes, and they were fantastic. I mean, they were collaborative. They brought local thinking. They understood the code issues, which are crucial to getting a great building built. They understood the constructability issues to help navigate around. Let's not go down that route. Let's go down that route. But they also left it open for innovation. And obviously, there's different tiers of, hey, these architects are great. These architects are pretty good. And you want to work with the great ones if you're trying to do something, as a great outcome or trying to really innovate. But there's really strong firms and we just love, again, like I mentioned, we're doing a big project in Lexington, Kentucky, working with a local firm. That's crucial to understanding the local fabric, to really getting to the essence of the place, how meaningful this building is to that place.
And it seems like we talk about technology and data, and I talked about using data to sort of make judgments on what's been built, but it seems like there's an opportunity to even do that before you built it. You might be able to use data to get feedback from the community on what they want and what they might need.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. We use data a lot in the design process, obviously optimizing all of the different sort of human aspects of the design and the performative aspects. And we do a lot of community outreach depending on the building type. And I think we're pushing to do more and more of that now, because we see, from an equity point of view, sort of justice and design point of view, the more that we can be getting that sort of data interaction with the community, the better the outcome will be. So we're really ramping up that whole aspect of our design process.
Well, that's that to me, obviously, I think you're smart to say, we can't design for a specific technology because things will change, but it's great to to use what you have right now to make a better city. And it seems like there's a lot of opportunity to improve on some of those examples I showed in the past, and even examples that are going up now, because it's a learning process. And I think this is a really exciting future that's just sort of I think we're just scratching the surface of what's possible.
Oh yeah, I totally agree.
Great, thank you, Jonathan. I think over the ages, architects have always kind of come up with their utopian visions for future cities, and I think in our time we actually have the opportunity to build them. And I love the idea of putting people and environment at the forefront of the agenda of future cities. So thank you so much for sharing the detailed vision plans for the new city that you're building. This is a really exciting conversation. Thank you so much to everyone also for joining us. Sam?
Yes, really, and thanks to Arc Daily, and thank you to everybody who listened, and please share this with friends. It'll be on our YouTube site, so people can watch this after we're done. And we're just, Jonathan, we're really thrilled to have you on. This is a great conversation, and hopefully we'll keep it going.
I just want to leave you with this. So the traditional city and the future city. Just sort of think about that. I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, let's hope that happens. I'm all for it. I'm all for it. It doesn't have to be utopian. It can be real.
That's right.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Have a great day, and see you soon.
Have a great day, everybody. Talk to you.
Great. Thanks again.
Bye-bye.